The smoke hadn't even cleared over Najaf when the first complaint came through. April 2004, southern Iraq, and someone in procurement was losing their mind over requisition forms that didn't match standard issue anything. The Delta operators who'd just cleared 15 city blocks in under 6 hours weren't carrying M4 carbines. They weren't carrying M16 variants. They weren't carrying anything that had passed through regular Army channels, and the bureaucrats back in Kuwait were having an absolute meltdown about it. But nobody who'd watched the Najaf operation gave a damn about paperwork. The battle for Najaf was supposed to be a nightmare. Intelligence reports painted a picture of entrenched Mahdi Army fighters, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 militants who'd had weeks to prepare defensive positions. The city's narrow alleys and religious significance meant any operation would be politically sensitive and tactically brutal. Iraqi forces were stalling. Coalition command was nervous. The kind of urban meat grinder that turned into another Fallujah was exactly what nobody wanted in the international press. Then Delta showed up with guns nobody recognized. The first thing observers noticed was the sound, or rather the lack of it. When Delta's assaulters opened up during the initial breach, the report was different, flatter, more controlled than the standard crack of military rifles. These weren't the weapons that rolled off government contract assembly lines. These were custom builds, privately purchased, individually tailored pieces that cost more than some soldiers made in 6 months. And they were turning the Mahdi Army positions into scrap metal with a precision that bordered on surgical. The operators had gone shopping on their own dime. HK-416 rifles with custom barrel assemblies, Knight's armament uppers mated to bespoke lowers. Suppressors that actually worked, not the clunky military-issue cans that added weight and maybe dropped a few decibels. Optics that cost $3,000 apiece. Triggers tuned to break at exactly 3 pounds with 0 creep. Every weapon was a personal statement, built to the individual shooter's specifications, tested on their own time, paid for out of pocket. The contrast was embarrassing. Regular infantry units carrying rifles that had seen service since the Vietnam era, components wearing out, accuracy degrading with every magazine. Meanwhile, Delta's shooters were running equipment that would make competitive shooters jealous, and they were using it to clear rooms at a pace that seemed impossible. But this was only the opening act. The Mahdi Army had numbers and home field advantage. They knew every alley, every rooftop, every place to stage an ambush. What they didn't know was that they were fighting an opponent who'd spent 20 years turning urban combat into a science. The militia fighters kept trying to fall back to prepared positions, kept trying to use the tactics that had worked against conventional forces. They might as well have been using muskets. Delta's approach to Najaf wasn't about overwhelming firepower. It was about speed, precision, and psychological dominance. Small teams moving through the city like they owned it, which in practical terms they did. While Mahdi Army fighters were still trying to coordinate defensive positions, Delta was already 3 blocks ahead, cutting off escape routes, isolating strong points, turning the battlefield into a series of kill zones that the enemy walked into without realizing they'd been outmaneuvered. The private arsenal made the difference in ways that standard equipment simply couldn't. When you're clearing buildings in 100-degree heat, every ounce matters. When you need to make a 300-meter shot through a narrow alley, accuracy matters. When you're operating in close quarters and the difference between identifying hostile and civilian is a fraction of a second, trigger control matters. The Delta operators had optimized every variable, and it showed in the body count. Hour by hour, the Mahdi Army's defensive line collapsed. Positions that should have taken days to reduce fell in minutes. Strong points that were supposed to anchor the militia's control of entire neighborhoods got rolled up before the fighters inside realized they were already surrounded. The speed of Delta's advance was demoralizing, the kind of operational tempo that breaks units psychologically before they're physically defeated. And the whole time, those custom rifles kept working flawlessly. There's a specific kind of frustration that comes from watching an enemy who's better equipped on a personal level. The Mahdi Army fighters were carrying AK-47s, PKM machine guns, RPGs, the standard kit for irregular forces. Reliable enough, proven in conflicts across decades. But reliability means nothing when you're up against shooters who can put rounds through a 6-inch gap at 200 meters while moving. The technical superiority was total, humiliating even. By the third day of operations, the militia was fragmenting. Leaders were abandoning positions. Fighters were melting back into the civilian population. The iron grip the Mahdi Army had held over Najaf was disintegrating under pressure that felt relentless and unstoppable. Delta hadn't just won tactically, they'd shattered the enemy's will to fight. This wasn't the kind of victory that made headlines. There were no dramatic last stands, no heroic charges, just a systematic dismantling of an enemy force by operators who'd brought better tools and knew exactly how to use them. The after-action reports were clinical, almost boring in their efficiency. Objectives secured, casualties minimal, enemy combat effectiveness destroyed. But inside the special operations community, Najaf became a case study. The lesson wasn't subtle. Standard issue equipment was a compromise, built to the lowest common denominator, designed to work adequately in the hands of minimally trained personnel. It was cheap, it was mass-produced, and it was good enough for most situations. But Delta didn't operate in most situations. They operated in scenarios where good enough meant people died, where every technical advantage mattered, where the difference between success and catastrophic failure could come down to whether your rifle could maintain accuracy after firing 400 rounds in 100-degree heat. So they bought their own guns. The bureaucratic nightmare this created was legendary. Procurement officers had procedures, regulations, standardization requirements. You couldn't just let soldiers show up with whatever weapons they felt like carrying. There were safety concerns, maintenance concerns, ammunition compatibility concerns. The paperwork alone was enough to give supply sergeants an aneurysm. Delta's response was basically to ignore the complaints and keep doing what worked. This attitude, this willingness to bypass official channels to get the job done, was embedded in the unit's culture from day one. When Colonel Charlie Beckwith founded Delta Force in 1977, he'd built it specifically to avoid the kind of institutional rigidity that plagued conventional units. The British SAS model he'd studied emphasized flexibility, individual initiative, and results over procedure. If a piece of equipment worked better than standard issue, you used it. If it didn't, you found something that did. That philosophy was on full display in Najaf. The city itself had symbolic importance beyond its tactical value. Home to the Imam Ali Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, Najaf was a political powder keg. Any heavy-handed coalition response risked inflaming sectarian tensions across Iraq. The operation required precision, restraint, and the kind of measured application of force that only came from supreme confidence in your capabilities. Delta had that confidence because they had the tools to back it up. While other units were making do with rifles that jammed in desert sand, Delta's weapons kept cycling. While other units struggled with optics that fogged or failed, Delta's custom glass stayed clear. While other units dealt with suppressors that shifted point of impact or fell apart after sustained fire, Delta's cans held zero and kept working. The technical edge wasn't flashy, but it was decisive. The Mahdi Army never stood a chance. Muqtada al-Sadr's militia had been riding high on recent victories against less capable opponents. They'd seized control of several Iraqi cities, embarrassed coalition forces in firefights, and were positioning themselves as the vanguard of resistance against occupation. Najaf was supposed to be their fortress, the place where they'd prove that irregular forces could hold territory against American military might. Instead, they got rolled up by a few dozen guys with expensive rifles. The psychological impact was profound. You can't maintain insurgent morale when your best fighters, your most ideologically committed warriors, get systematically destroyed by an enemy that seems to operate on a different level entirely. The Mahdi Army had expected a slugging match, street-to-street fighting where numbers and familiarity with terrain would compensate for American technological advantages. What they got was a masterclass in how Special Operations Forces dismantle opposition. The speed of Delta's clearances became the stuff of legend. Buildings that intelligence predicted would take hours to secure were cleared in 15 minutes. Positions that should have required air support or artillery got reduced by small teams using nothing but personal weapons and tactical cunning. The efficiency was almost insulting. And those personal weapons, those privately purchased rifles, were the physical embodiment of Delta's approach to war. Every operator had customized their weapon system to their exact specifications. Barrel lengths varied based on individual mission profiles. Some shooters preferred 14.5-inch barrels for maneuverability in close quarters. Others went with 16 or 18 inches for better ballistics at extended ranges. The modular nature of modern rifle platforms meant you could swap uppers, change configurations, optimize for specific scenarios. Delta took that modularity and weaponized it. One operator might be carrying an HK-416 with a 10-inch barrel and suppressor optimized for room clearing. His teammate might have a longer setup with a variable power optic for precision fire. Another might be running a different platform entirely, something that fit his shooting style better. The diversity of equipment would give a conventional armorer a heart attack, but Delta's logistics personnel made it work, because that's what the mission required. The ammunition was equally customized, not standard M855 ball, but match-grade rounds selected for consistency and terminal performance. Hollow points for urban environments where over-penetration was a concern. Barrier-blind rounds for shooting through car doors or light cover. The level of detail in weapons configuration was obsessive, and in Najaf, that obsession paid dividends. But the rifles were just one component of a larger system. Delta's communications gear was more sophisticated than what most infantry battalions had access to. Their night vision was a generation ahead of standard issue. Their body armor was lighter and more protective. Their medical equipment was better. Their vehicles were modified beyond recognition. Every single piece of gear had been evaluated, tested, and often replaced with something that performed better. The entire kit represented a philosophy: optimize everything, accept no compromises, and pay for upgrades out of your own pocket if that's what it takes to stay alive and complete the mission. This wasn't unique to Najaf. Delta had been operating this way for years. But Najaf made it visible to a wider audience within the military community, and the implications were uncomfortable for a lot of people. If a relatively small unit could achieve this level of effectiveness by ditching standard equipment, what did that say about the gear everyone else was using? If privately purchased rifles were that much better, why was the military spending billions on inferior weapon systems? The answers were complex and political. Defense procurement operated on a scale that made individual optimization impossible. Contracts went to the lowest bidder who could meet minimum specifications. Weapons had to work for 18-year-old recruits with minimal training, not just elite operators with decades of experience. Standardization meant interchangeable parts, simplified logistics, easier maintenance across massive formations, all of which made perfect sense until you watched Delta clear Najaf in a fraction of the time it should have taken. The tension between institutional needs and operational reality wasn't new. Special Operations Forces had always existed in a different space, with different rules, different expectations. But as their operational tempo increased during the Iraq War, the divergence became harder to ignore. Delta operators were going through ammunition at rates that would drain a conventional unit's annual budget in weeks. They were burning through expensive optics, replacing barrels after hard use, maintaining weapons to standards that required specialized knowledge, and they were getting results that justified every penny. The Mahdi Army's collapse in Najaf didn't end the insurgency in Iraq. Muqtada al-Sadr would rise again, the militia would reconstitute, and urban combat would continue to chew up coalition forces for years. But the battle established a template for how Delta approached urban operations, and that template relied heavily on technical superiority achieved through private procurement. Other units noticed. SEAL Team 6 had similar policies, though with different specific choices in equipment. Army Special Forces groups started pushing for more flexibility in weapon selection. Even some conventional infantry units began exploring ways to give soldiers access to better gear, though bureaucratic resistance remained fierce. The bureaucrats back in Kuwait never did figure out how to properly account for Delta's arsenal. The requisition forms stayed incomplete, the serial numbers didn't match official records, and the whole thing was a paperwork disaster. But nobody with actual operational authority cared, because the mission results spoke for themselves. Najaf demonstrated something that military theorists had been arguing about for decades. Individual soldier quality matters more than raw numbers in modern warfare. A handful of superbly trained operators with optimized equipment could achieve effects that entire companies of regular infantry couldn't match. The force multiplier wasn't just training, it was the marriage of training with equipment that let those skills actually matter. The Mahdi Army learned this lesson the hard way. Their fighters weren't cowards, weren't incompetent. Many had combat experience, local knowledge, ideological commitment. They'd prepared defensive positions, gathered intelligence, organized their forces. They'd done everything right according to conventional insurgent doctrine. They still got shredded. The custom rifles were part of it, but only part. Delta's real advantage was a culture that demanded excellence in every aspect of operations and provided the freedom to achieve it. If standard issue boots gave you blisters, you bought better boots. If standard issue night vision was inadequate, you got better tubes. If standard issue rifles were garbage, you built something better. That last part, the rifles being garbage, wasn't quite accurate. The M4 carbine was a decent weapon system for its intended role. It was reliable enough, accurate enough, maintainable enough for mass distribution to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What it wasn't was optimized for the specific demands of Tier 1 special operations. Delta needed weapons that could maintain precision over thousands of rounds fired in compressed time periods. They needed modularity to adapt to rapidly changing mission profiles. They needed suppressors that actually suppressed without destroying accuracy. They needed triggers that let them make split-second decisions about firing with complete confidence. They needed equipment that matched their skill level, and standard issue didn't cut it. So they fixed the problem themselves. The financial burden fell on the operators personally, which created its own issues. A fully customized rifle setup could easily run $5,000 or more. Ammunition costs for maintaining proficiency were substantial. Replacement parts, upgraded components, accessories, all of it added up. Delta operators weren't wealthy, they were making military salaries, but they spent like professional athletes investing in their careers, because that's what it was, an investment. Better equipment meant better performance, which meant staying alive, which meant continuing to do the job. The calculus was simple, even if the price tag wasn't. The Najaf operation validated that investment in the most direct way possible. The militia forces that should have tied up coalition forces for weeks got neutralized in days. The urban terrain that should have favored defenders became a killing ground. The political sensitivity that should have constrained operations got managed through precise application of violence that minimized collateral damage. And through it all, those expensive custom rifles kept working. The after-action reports made for interesting reading, at least for the people with sufficient clearance to access them. Clinical descriptions of movements, engagements, enemy casualties, Dry recitations of tactics and techniques. Nothing that would make it into popular consciousness, no dramatic narratives for public consumption. But within the special operations community, the lessons spread quickly. Najaf became shorthand for doing things right, for refusing to accept limitations imposed by bureaucratic convenience. It became an example of what was possible when you empowered skilled people to make their own decisions about equipment and tactics. The broader military establishment had more complicated reactions. Some saw it as validation of special operations doctrine, proof that investing in elite units paid dividends. Others saw it as an indictment of standard procurement, evidence that the system was failing regular soldiers. Still others dismissed it as irrelevant to conventional operations, arguing that what worked for a tiny special missions unit couldn't scale to divisions and corps. All of those perspectives had validity, but none of them changed the fundamental truth that Najaf had demonstrated. When it comes to close quarters battle against a determined enemy, the quality of your individual equipment matters enormously, and standard issue isn't always good enough. Delta Force had known this since their inception. They'd built an organizational culture around it, created systems to support it, and accepted the complications it created. Najaf just made it visible to everyone else. The Mahdi Army's defeat in the city had ripple effects across Iraq's insurgent landscape. Other militia groups took note that the Americans had units that could operate at a tempo and effectiveness level beyond what they'd prepared for. The narrative of successful resistance took a hit. The calculation about whether to engage in direct confrontation with coalition forces got more complicated. None of this ended the war or solved Iraq's fundamental problems, but it did establish parameters for what certain American units could do when fully resourced and freed from normal constraints. Those parameters were intimidating. The private arsenal that Delta brought to Najaf represented more than just better guns. It represented a philosophy of warfare that prioritized results over process, effectiveness over standardization, individual optimization over institutional convenience. That philosophy had deep roots in American special operations, going back to OSS operations in World War II, continuing through Vietnam-era studies groups, and reaching full expression in the post-Cold War era. Najaf was just one battle in a long war, one city among many that saw fighting during the Iraq occupation. But it crystallized something important about how modern special operations forces actually work, about the gap between what they carry and what everyone else carries, about why that gap exists and what it enables. The operators who cleared those streets weren't thinking about making statements or proving points. They were focused on the immediate tactical problem of neutralizing threats while staying alive. The weapons they carried were tools, not symbols. But the fact that those tools were privately purchased, individually customized, and dramatically more effective than standard issue made a statement whether anyone intended it or not. That statement was simple. Your rifles are garbage, so we bought our own, and watch what we can do with them. The lesson from Najaf echoed through special operations units worldwide, influenced procurement decisions at the highest levels, and shifted conversations about how to equip elite forces. The debate continues, the bureaucratic tensions remain, but the operational reality is clear. When Delta Force goes to war, they bring the best equipment they can get their hands on, regardless of where it comes from or who paid for it. Najaf proved why that matters.